There we go. Okay, good.
Yes. Yeah, sounds great.
We have an audience. I'm going to actually let them file in for a minute here.
Yeah.
Mayor, can I just, thank you.
Yep.
This will be fun. Yeah.
And you? Okay. Everybody's jumping in before. Okay. All right. All right, manager.
All right, I'm joined today by Lydia Kay, who's just going to kick it off and lead us through today's discussion. I think she was just pausing for a minute to let everybody kind of enter the room.
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council.
Lydia, you might just move your microphone closer. I know that they can't hear in the back, yeah.
I will hold off a couple more minutes or seconds.
We've turned this chamber into a short-term rental, so just,
$5 on the way out the door?
Whatever
yes.
it takes. It's 10.
Okay. So, thank you, Mayor and Councilors. Lydia Kay, Building and Permit Services Director, and here to talk with you about short-term rentals. We prepared a draft ordinance after a work session on September 23rd, when you directed us to craft an ordinance with a number of regulations, including an owner occupancy requirement, parking requirements, limits on the number of days short-term rentals can be rented when the owner isn't present, revocation of permits for repeat code violations, and requirements for the platforms to assist in the regulations. Staff also included a recommendation in your packet that the council consider a grandfather clause if the regulations are proposed. One of the questions that arose at the last work session was whether staff could determine if platforms like Airbnb or Expedia are purchasing homes for short-term rentals, and we did look into that. There really isn't a way for us to gather that information unless they use their name. However, we did want to point out that we don't have any evidence that this is happening in Eugene. So we have been tracking the public comments regarding this issue, as I know you all have been, and understand that there is interest from short-term rental owners to take a more thoughtful approach and obtain feedback from the operators of the short-term rentals, as well as those who are impacted in the neighborhoods. And staff is certainly supportive of such an approach. We could bring together an ad hoc committee to gather feedback and get recommendations from owner-operators and neighbors and bring that information back to the City Council. Staff did create a website when we drafted the agenda item summary, and we have information there with the process to date. We've also created an interested parties list so people can sign up, and we will update the interested parties list with council's direction today, and that can also generate some names for us to be able to reach out for those who are interested in participating in the process, if you so choose. So at this point, I don't have any further comments. We're available to answer questions and to receive feedback on next steps related to short-term rentals.
Okay, I have Claire, Alan, Betty, and Mike in the queue.
Thank you. Excuse me, thank you. So as I indicated after public comment at our work session on Monday, I think we need to do more due diligence on this matter before we put a draft ordinance out for a public hearing, both in terms of getting more information and input from short-term rental hosts and as well as nearby neighbors, as well as getting more concrete factual information about the impacts, both positive and negative, that such rentals have on our community. So, you know, we've heard a lot of speculation. We've generated some of that speculation in terms of both the positive and negatives. And I feel like we had some really compelling testimony from folks, some of whom I think are here again today, about many of them hosts themselves, and it really kind of opened my eyes to the variety of ways in which people are approaching this work, whether it's a room in their own home or a home they've bought and they live somewhere else in Eugene. We got an email from a woman who lives sometimes out of the area and has a person she pays to operate as the host and mind the property. So the city attorney sent me some information, kind of thinking about a motion I'd make, and I could wait for another round of discussion before I put my motion out, but basically the motion I hope to put out and have passed is that we have staff create an advisory committee to make recommendations around this, and that committee would engage short-term rental hosts and owners who represent the variety of ways in which people are doing this work, and as well as reaching out to neighbors of those places and getting us some facts about the numbers of them in the community, as much detail as we can about the tax and what that generates. I know that goes through Travel County. It doesn't necessarily come directly to the city, but I could be wrong about that. So getting some real good information about that. So I'll wait for further discussion, but that is a motion I hope to put forward and have approved.
Alan?
I'll wait to second that.
Okay.
Not if I beat you to it, brother.
Me.
I called it first. Yeah, I think more input is appropriate, and also a lot more communication there, and more clarity about what was proposed, because I heard some people say things that were clearly not being regulated at the forum the other night, and other concerns that we need to address. For instance, the ideas of potentially, if you own only one non-owner occupied thing and unit in the city, and you're a Eugene, Lane County resident, then maybe there's an exemption for it. Because what we're really trying to get at is the folks that are basically buying properties up, running the hotels in residential neighborhoods and having 10, 12, 13 of them, I've heard as much as people doing that, and running them as businesses in residential neighborhoods, and that's not what residential neighborhoods are about. There is a difference, and maybe staff could articulate this better, but there is a difference between a long-term rental and a short-term Airbnb, short-term rental Airbnb type of thing. There's more turnover, there's less community, there's expectations that people had when they bought their houses about what their neighbors were gonna be doing and and that the people weren't gonna be running a business in their neighborhood. And so maybe we could also get some education about what the rules are about running home businesses. Those should be aligned with this process as well, because this is basically a business. So those two things need to come into alignment. I agree that the transient room tax enforcement issue, I think Portland did a preliminary study and said like 28% of people who should are paying it. So maybe there's some more to be done there. And what we heard, though, was a lot of people who were the responsible hosts, which is great. And we were never trying to regulate people who were renting out a room or an ADU, which, by the way, we should clarify that an ADU is the same as renting out a room, and that qualifies as owner-occupied. But that's not what we were trying to do. What we were trying to do was the two big issues that are very real that I've gotten complaints about over the years, especially in my neighborhood around the university, are one, there's just people coming and going at all hours of the day, and as much as 10, 12 people living in there at one point, when it's really not what's supposed to be happening in a residential neighborhood. Should be not more than 5. And that they are not good neighbors, that they were party houses, that they were very loud, very noisy, and very disrespectful of the fact that they're in a neighborhood, because they don't live there and they don't care, and so they just went on. So we've got, those are very real. And so the people that we heard from and the people that are here were the people who did it right, and were doing it respectfully of their neighbors, even talking to their neighbors and checking it out. So that's not what we're trying to get at. It's the other problem. So maybe the complaints and the other, the registration and that stuff gets at that better.
Okay. Betty?
Thank you. We are way behind. I don't think we're rushing at all. I have a list here of cities in Oregon that have regulations for short-term rentals, and it's most of them of any size, as well as a lot of small ones. I was hoping we'd get some information about Hood River, for example. We didn't get that. I talked to the mayor of Hood River a couple of years ago. He said that the short-term rentals have done a great deal of damage in his community. And I want to make it clear, nobody's talking about saying about people who are living in a house and using a room or 2 rooms this way. We're talking about people who are running many hotels. And this has happened to Hood River, so that the mayor told me his children's teachers can't live in the city anymore because buildings, the medium price buildings have been used for short-term rentals where you can make a lot more money in a hurry than you can from renting to have someone by the month. I thought the ordinance that you came up with was very good. I had a couple of suggestions, but it's a very good one. It is not too early to do this. It's too late almost already. But, and I think I had a question when you said about the grandfather. I think that meant letting people have a year to change. Is that correct?
Yes, Counselor Taylor.
That makes
Some
sense.
period of time, so they.
If you're running a little hotel instead of renting part of your house, you could have a year. It makes sense to have a year to either sell the house or change it to a different kind of use. But protecting a house or making money is no excuse for damaging a neighborhood or for destroying the possibility of medium or low-priced housing for people who are renters. I did have a couple of questions. Number of bedrooms which could be rented. I don't think the draft ordinance said that, did it?
It didn't specify the number of bedrooms. What we were looking at is using the definition of family so that that no more than 5 people,
Yes,
non-related
I know,
people.
I saw that, yes.
So
I thought perhaps there should be a limit of 2 bedrooms that could be rented, but at the same time, but, and the number of violations, it said 3. I thought 2 would be sufficient. 2 violations in a year would be plenty. 3 is allowing a lot. The number, and I didn't see anything about really restricting the number of short-term rentals that could be in one block or one area.
the direction that was provided to staff at the 23rd was not to include that as a.
Understand. I still think we should consider that. I said, I understand that some blocks have just been turned over to. However, the really crucial thing is that we require owner occupancy. If the owner is in the house, then that does tame it down considerably. That is just like having company. And I think the parking was important. It was really a good job. I wondered why bed and breakfast places, what does that mean, excluding bed and breakfast?
Well, when I was working with the city attorney on drafting the ordinance, we wanted to make sure that the definition of short-term rentals would not require bed and breakfast owners that are currently have operating bed and breakfast to go through that licensing process.
I think the licensing is really important too, and I don't usually use up my time, but I guess I have done it. But good job as far as it goes anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a lifelong advocate of free markets and free people, and I think this is one of the best examples of it working well, in my opinion. There are some, as Claire was accurately saying, there are some issues around that, and that's our job to wear the stripes in the game when that's necessary. My default position is to create regulation and restrictions as little as humanly possible to make sure that you take care of the problems that are unjust to the surrounding neighbors. Frankly, though, we already have noise ordinances in place that can address that. But this new kind of economy is a good one. It lets everybody participate in this way, and I think that's a fantastic thing. The apps themselves are full of tools that allow the market to decide, hey, those guys are doing it right, and those guys are doing it really wrong, and the ones that are doing it really right and treating people well are the ones that will succeed and go and over the long term. So I will be happy to vote in favor of Claire's motion and second it if I'm fast enough. And be able to allow those who are experts in working in this for so long, and then the neighbors who are dealing with this for a while now, to be the ones to put their concrete, actual pragmatic concerns into the discussion so that we find solutions that work, and then to regulate, from my perspective, as little as humanly necessary to allow this to work and work well for everybody. I hope that's what we will do. I would also say that the rise of this stuff seems very natural to me. One of the things that I've talked about real briefly before, but I think we all have to get used to, is the economic model of almost all our communities of single-family homes in neighborhoods is built to a cultural model that doesn't exist anymore economically. That none of this economically was built for single adults to live in a house alone. None of it was built for multiple adults to live in houses together and with children. And so as we, as a culture, are spending more of our desire to live alone in these places, we need economic assistance in the process of being able to afford it, because the model's not built for it. And I think that has to inform how we think about what we're building tomorrow, too. So, FYI. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, to kind of parallel some of our previous discussions, I think the thing that's lacking the most for me here is clarity. We're trying to approach this as a relatively straightforward and simple problem that needed a solution. And now what's become apparent is, one, if it's a problem, it's a far more complicated and variable issue than we thought it was initially. There's many different kinds of configurations, many different kinds of setups, many different people and things that are involved, and we lack any information with regard to each one of those areas. I mean, just on Monday I heard, and I have heard, anywhere from we're talking about 200 units to we're talking 7,000 units, and each person passionately believes it's 200 or it's 7,000, and we don't know for sure. I talked to a guy who knows a guy who says Expedia is buying up all the homes in Eugene to turn into, is that true? Is that not true? You yourself have said we've not been able to gather information. That doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means we don't have the information. So I couldn't agree more. We need to slow down long enough to know exactly what it is we're dealing with, so you don't solve what you perceive to be one problem simply to create two more that you didn't anticipate because you didn't have the information. So I want to make sure what's really going on here, what the real impact is. I've heard less about, well, just the fact of having a short-term rental means it's a problem. Most of the time when I've heard problems, I've heard, as Alan very articulately said, party houses, too many people, drunken parties coming at all hours. Those are all things that can be managed with different kinds of tools. We have a social host ordinance that my understanding is has worked pretty well at calming some of the parties that were occurring in the university neighborhood. So there are mechanisms you can put in place that don't require a ban, or even if you're not really talking, absolutely convinced that there needs to be some level of regulation just to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. But what that level needs to be has got to be based on facts. And at this point, I don't have enough facts to really know how many of these are needed, are configured the way they should be configured, or are there other additional mechanisms that could be used to help make this better than it could be. So I will absolutely support the idea of slowing down.
Okay, Craig.
Yeah, I think that Chris channeled a lot of what I want to say. I'm going to support Claire's motion because I think we do need to slow down. We need to gather more data. We also need to know whether there's an abusive trend that is going on in the community around this. And what I mean by that is also further doing a deeper dive on who are the people that own these units. Are they local versus somebody who is outside of the area that, again, could be gobbling up units as investment properties, for short-term rentals. You said yourself, Lydia, that, there's no evidence that the platforms themselves are doing that, but there may be people who are tangentially related to those platforms who are doing those things. And I would like to see what has happened based on other experiences in other communities. Betty has already alluded to what some of the issues were at Hood River, but I think that we need to get a broader, more accurate sample to be able to assess that data and to determine where we have abuses at and where we don't. And I think that is critically important to any kind of regulation that we shape at this table. I don't think that, we should be shaping regulations based on things that we really don't have the research on and the documentation to do that. So that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it. But, I got a call from an old friend of mine recently about this who is, operating a short-term rental. And, his biggest fear is that we go in and over-regulate, that basically his secondary source of income. And that has helped him pay a lot of bills, deal with a lot of stuff that you need to deal with, including upgrading and maintaining those rental properties. There are other factors here that we, are not really looking at that I think that we need to be able to have the ability to do a deeper dive on. So.
Okay, I have Betty and Mike asking for a second round. I know we're coming back to Claire for a motion, and I have Alan for a second round. Okay.
Next, right?
And so you are next, Betty.
Thank you. This is very discouraging. There is plenty of information we can get there. I have a list here of how many people. 32 cities in Oregon that already have regulations. And there are plenty of cases where, and I did suggest recently that all of you read the article in the April 28th New Yorker about Barcelona, Spain, which was almost destroyed by short-term rentals. And there are plenty of places in Oregon where we can get information. We don't have to start over, but in relation to my friend Mike's saying that the rise in these things is natural, that is the reason we have government, to control the natural impulses that interfere with the quality of life of people. We wouldn't need government if we all did what was natural. I could just come and take your house or come and move into it. And there are a lot of things that we're restricted in, and the ways we can make money are, there are all sorts of ways you can make money in your home that would not be allowed. Or buy a home, and you could start a what's so-called adult bookstore in the middle of the neighborhood and make a lot of money, maybe, if people weren't ashamed to be seen there. But
that only happens in Texas, Betty.
this is,
Easy that they're ashamed of it.
there is,
Oh, respect your time, please.
I don't think you have I'm done.
I'm asking them to respect your time.
I don't think that people have a right to make money at the expense of their neighbors. No one has said, and it's strange how this feeling got around that we were going to say we're banning. We're not banning. You can do it in your own home. Can't read my own writing without my glasses. Owner occupancy, and as far as clarity is concerned, owner occupancy is very clear. It's the owner's home in which he or she is renting part of from time to time. And there's no dim thing about that. That's clear, and it's not banning. It's just saying that it has to be, if you say you're renting part of your home, it should be your home, not a home you bought just to rent. And this is, I think the citizen who said, little hotels don't belong in neighborhoods was exactly right. As far as waiting is concerned, we know that there are going to be a lot more people coming to Eugene, and the situation will get worse if we wait. And there will be more people who will have to, if we do decide that you have 1 year to change it, there'll be more people who've been in the situation of needing to change. I think it's really urgent it's an urgent matter, and it's not something that needs a committee. We don't need to know how many there are to know what practices are acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. As much as I like you, Betty, and as much as they say so in the paper, and as much as I agree with you on some really important things, on this point, we have never agreed, and we never will, I suspect. But I need to say it really clear. These folks got together a couple of 100 years ago, and they wrote down that, the purpose of the American government is to protect people's rights. Okay? That's the purpose of government here, is that we're all born with certain individual freedoms and rights, and the purpose of government is to protect them. They said those words pretty exactly. So one of the other issues I think we're going to face that we ought to address with this, I don't know how. I don't have a suggestion about how to word it as an amendment, and I don't have clear direction for staff on what kind of information I would like back in order to address it. But I know we're going to see it. We're going to, before the year's out, I'm sure, we're going to find a way to incentivize, one way or another, the building of more ADUs. I'm just certain we will. House Bill 2001 is going to, once fully implemented and everything around that, we're going to have an awful lot more duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes. And I'm already having conversations in my professional life about how to finance those and see more of them built. The more of those that come in, many of them that are being built and financed are for the sole purpose of making them short-term rentals. So I think we ought to be thinking towards whether or not we want to encourage or discourage, and I don't know which, frankly, I'm not going to say which, the creation of more small units that are intended from their creation to be short-term rentals. But I think we really ought to be thinking through and talking about the likelihood of it and what the impact of our discussions this year on both ADUs and implementation of House Bill 2001, what that will do to the short-term rental market. Thank you.
Okay. Alan.
Yeah, we do need more analysis on the impact that this has on affordable housing. If there are indeed 7,000 units that are taken off the market and put into short-term rentals, that means they're not in the long-term rental affordable housing market, and some of these aren't even affordable. So that deserves more information that we can get. I'm not sure we can get that much more. I do want to look at one of the things Betty said that's not in there right now, which is other folks in the country have taken a look at minimum distance between short-term rentals. We did that work with pot stores, or number per block. Because that's the balance that we're struggling with here, which is the balance between the expectations that people have when they move in and buy a house in a residential neighborhood around livability and what those things are going on. And the world's changing around them, and so we have to keep up with it. And also people's rights to earn supplemental income and bolster their own livability. And those two things sometimes clash, sometimes they're in harmony, so that's great. We're not trying to eliminate the harmony one, but when they clash, that's where we step in. And the right to earn supplemental income is not an unlimited right. we regulate currently all sorts of things in residential neighborhoods. We don't allow people to do any kind of home business they want and have all sorts of people coming and going all day long. So there is already some established rules. I'd like to see how this fits within that context. And maybe for those bad actors, the social host ordinance, which I pushed for a long time and worked extremely well in the neighborhoods around the university, is a model that maybe this could be applied to, that can handle some of those things. So that would be another thing I would like to look at. But Greg, I agree we shouldn't regulate if we don't have all the data, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to get all the data. We've already taken a cursory look and said it's very difficult to come by that. But that shouldn't also stop us from preventing and regulating the things that we don't want to see happen. If someone's doing a little empire of a whole bunch of non-owner occupied mini hotels, and maybe they have 5 on a block right next to each other, then that's something I don't think anybody on this council wants to see happen. So just because we can't prove that doesn't mean, or have data around it, doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to prevent those things from happening.
Okay, I think we're almost ready for Claire's motion, but I'm going to just jump in for 1 minute. Counselors have all said things that I would have said also. I think that what has been powerful to me about the public forum and about this conversation is that I think we had sort of only really heard from one side on this issue before that public forum on Monday night. We'd really heard about the neighborhood folks who are worried about neighborhood livability with respect to these home businesses. And I think we heard the other side on Monday night, and so I just appreciate that recognizing how actually important this is income generating. This is also an investment in our existing housing stock, a lot of it. I mean, there are a lot of people who testified that they had fixed up an ADU, they had fixed up a room, they had upgraded an apartment in order to sublet it. I mean, we are looking for ways to constantly improve our housing stock, and that means upgrading existing housing stock as well. And because a current owner is using it as a short-term rental doesn't mean that the owner 10 years from now will use it that way, and that investment will have been made in that property. So I think, there is this sort of an immediate impact, but we are also looking at the long term, and I think we should keep that in mind. And so that just plays into something that Claire said on Monday night and that I've said since is, let's be really clear what problem it is we're trying to solve. And I think everyone has basically looked at it that way. So I'm grateful to all of you for thinking about taking a little more time and collecting more data, because there's clearly lots of layers to this. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I had some comments as well. And first, since many of them are here in the audience, I wanted to compliment our speakers on this issue on Monday night in your clear, respectful, fact-based, educational way that you presented your public comment. It was very much appreciated, and I went home and mentioned it to my husband, and I said, well, maybe that's a character that you have to be a successful short-term rental host. So I also want to appreciate Councillor Clark speaking to some of the changes in our economy, and I think the short-term rental market reflects our new economy in a similar way, not identical, but in a similar way that the rise of the use of Lyft and Uber has as well, and I think we need to acknowledge that. I don't think we understand enough about the implications of some of the elements of our draft ordinance, such as the 90-day limit or even the owner occupancy piece. And I think by engaging our residents more fully in this discussion, we will get better information and a better outcome in terms of a final ordinance. And one example might be providing us with ideas for how to address to ensure that owners have a responsible host who is readily available to address problems on the site. I think we cannot be making policy based on assumptions that might be baseless. This idea that whole blocks are being turned over to short-term rentals, that these rentals are driving our affordable housing crisis. These are examples. I do absolutely want to learn from what other communities have experienced, but we have our own unique dynamics in this community, one of them being that we are the home of the Ducks and Autzen Stadium, and I think we need to craft an ordinance that reflects that character. So I will make my motion. It's a little wordy, but I'm hoping to kind of capture some details. So Move to direct the city manager to create an ad hoc department advisory committee to make to make recommendations to city staff and departments concerning the implementation of city policy regarding the regulation of short-term rentals. This committee should engage with local short-term rental hosts and owners who represent the variety of ways in which these short-term rentals are currently configured and provide opportunities for neighbors impacted by them to share their perspective on the topic. The recommendations generated through this process should be analyzed by staff and brought back to council for further consideration.
Second.
Discussion, Emily?
Thank you. I'm worried a little bit that we're looking, that we went with the ordinance too fast instead of talking about the parts of it before we codified it. But I also worry about this turning into a really slow, drawn-out process. And some of it is affecting people now. So I don't have a lot of experience with ad hoc committees and how long it takes to get them, how long they would need to meet, how much more in-depth statistics we want staff to look for. And just an aside, I reread the white paper from the library. I really liked it. Not only was it incredibly informative, but it was easy to read. So I'm a little confused. Could I get any sort of, crystal ball of how much work we're asking for, how much time this public engagement might take? Because then the public hearing, then I know how that part goes.
Well, as I mentioned, we do have an interested parties list, and several people have already contacted me saying they're interested. So I think putting together the committee, having a few meetings, having the ability to receive the feedback won't take more than a few months. I would say maybe 3 months. Is that too long?
No, that's what I was going to say,
Okay.
too. Just because it's the holidays, and by the time you get the invites out and the schedules, it'd probably be before your spring break, we would be back.
And then a public hearing, so probably June, 6 months from now. Can we do anything to say we would like to definitely come back by then? Because I really am concerned. I've seen how these things get dragged out. And although I don't think we need to act today, I know there's a lot of concern on both sides about getting some answers. Thanks.
Yeah, Alan.
As the seconder of the motion, I'll make a.
Thought that was me.
We said it simultaneously. I would make a friendly amendment that we do the input process, put a deadline of March 31st with action before we go on break,
Summer break? Okay.
which is the end of July.
Yeah, I think
June.
that's totally reasonable.
I would accept that friendly amendment.
So would I, as the seconder of the motion.
I already did it.
Okay, Alan, was that's all you had to say? You're done. Okay, so Betty.
Thank you. I don't think we had a draft motion. If we had a public hearing, we were not acting at this moment, if we say advance it to public hearing. So it's not that we were doing it fast. And I don't know why we can't learn from the experiences of other cities and instead of having to have them all ourselves. And when you talk about a committee with the people who have a financial interest in the situation being on the committee, or people who have, or only those are only people who've been impacted, that is not a good committee. Thank you.
Yes.
So just wanted to make sure we've got clarification. Is the intent of the amendment, of the friendly amendment, that you all would be raising your hands and actually voting on a revised ordinance before you go out on break?
Yes.
Okay. That's a tight drafting schedule depending on what comes out of the committee, so, and how much more change in input you want to see. But that will be what everyone's working for. Yep.
Yeah.
Got it.
Is raising hands by.
You guys are awesome, I'm sure you.
And you have nothing else
already
to
have
do.
Just needs a few word changes.
Not adding, we'll be fine.
Yeah, right.
Okay, are we ready for a vote on this motion? Oh, Emily, go for it.
As I said, not knowing ad hocs very well, how would the determination be as to who's on the committee? And how would we make sure that it wasn't just people who want it one way now and just people who want it the other way? Because then we'll get the complaint that it wasn't fully representational, and that will put us farther behind. So any information about that? How do you make it ad hoc fair?
We do this a lot, so it's a department committee, so it'll be staff coming forward with a recommendation to me about who should be on there, or to Denny. And we'll just work really hard to make sure we have a fair representation of voices. You may still hear that, you know what I mean, at the end, that there wasn't enough representation, but I think we can work really hard to make that happen. We have a great list to start from.
And I would really encourage, if we're going to wait longer, that we continue our awesome outreach efforts, but really get into the neighborhoods, especially the ones with less representational or active groups, so that people aren't surprised that however the ordinance comes out, isn't a big groundswell of, well, I didn't know that this could happen in my neighborhood, or I didn't know I would be prevented from this supplemental income. So ad hoc is great, but realizing nothing can be 100% representational. I urge us to continue, surveys, outreaches, all those engage Eugene things.
Claire, did you have something else?
Yeah, so I just noted the other night that when, we spent, a good year and a half working with the companies, Uber and Lyft, not my favorite companies on the planet, to draft regulations that they thought they could live with. And I think we are not doing any disservice to our community by engaging our local residents who live here and are invested in our community before we regulate this home business that they are engaged in. And so just to reread what I said around that, this committee should engage with local short-term rental hosts and owners who represent the variety of ways in which these rentals are currently configured, and provide opportunities for neighbors impacted by these rentals to share their perspective on the topic. So I feel like in a 3-month period, you should be able to bring those folks together, get that input, generate the surveys, let the neighborhood groups know. I think there will be folks who are caught unawares. That always happens. But I feel like we can do our due diligence with this framework.
Okay, great. Okay, ready for a vote? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1, and it passes. Thank you very much. That was a great discussion. Thank all of you for your testimony and for coming. We are adjourned, and happy holidays. Yay.